Can you hear me now? All right, thanks folks. I see that some people found the questions box. Please feel free to write in questions as we go along, and I'll stop in between each section to answer those questions. So what I was saying, which you didn't hear, is that the Senate took the first step on the transportation bill. That has often been the case. It takes 4 committees in the Senate to pass a bill along, but the Environment and Public Works Committee is usually the ones who started off, and they do the biggest section, which is the highway section of the bill, which is where most of the things that affect biking and walking are. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the overall view of that bill, talk through league priorities and what's in there. I'm also going to talk about the climate title, because this is the first transportation bill that has had a climate title. And then finally, I'm going to do a little bit of analysis on why we got what we got and talk about going on to the next step. So, okay. Oops. All right. Oh, wait a second. I just switched views. Let me see if that helps. All right, next slide. Oh, sorry about this. All right, so in the overall highway bill, it's $287 billion over 5 years, roughly $57 billion a year. It includes an 18% increase in the first year and then builds from that every year after. If you've read anything about it, you'll also hear that 90% of the funding is in formula funds. By formula funds, I mean money that goes directly to the states that they don't apply for. It's their portion that they get. Now, it has been reported that they can do anything they want with formula funds. That is not necessarily true. And as I talk through some of the safety changes and some of the climate changes, much of those changes actually occur through money that's coming through the formula. So when we look at this funding, it's a big increase. It's a huge increase, and it will require $84 billion on top of Highway Trust Fund revenues. Both the chairman of the committee, Mr. Barrasso, Republican from Wyoming, and the ranking member, Mr. Carper from Delaware, both insist that this bill be paid for to move forward, and both have ideas and are working on revenue possibilities. So their staff, et cetera, are talking with the Finance Committee staff to make that happen. There's one big issue that could lower the funding in this bill or change how that happens, and that's because there were rescissions in the FAST Act. And what that means is there's a section in the current transportation bill, aka the FAST Act, that pulls back funding authority from the states. So even though the bill said you would have X number of dollars to spend to the states, they're going to pull some of that back. Actually, they're going to pull back $7.6 billion. And if that happens, that money could actually come out of some of this new money that we're seeing, because both Mr. Barrasso and Mr. Carper want to rescind the rescission, shall we say, repeal the rescissions. This bill does include language that would repeal that rescission, but this bill won't pass in time. They have a separate bill that would do that, and both the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in the House and the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate are trying to do this. However, that has to happen by September 30th in 2019. And that's because the way the rescission language is, it's after September 30th that FHWA calculates how much authority they're pulling back from the states, how much of that funding the states will not have. So that is something we're watching, and that is something you'll see the league may ask you to weigh in on in the next few weeks. A little bit about the leadership on EPW and what their priorities were. Again, Chairman Barrasso is from Wyoming. He was really concerned with a rural-urban balance, and you'll see that in some of the programs coming through. There's also some new safety money to help with crashes with wildlife, for instance, is a big piece. There's a piece in the climate change about alternative fuels corridors, which includes natural gas, important to his state, important to that area. A second priority of his was improved project delivery, so streamlining the permitting process. And third, he insisted that there be no new requirements on old money, basically, that he wanted incentives, not sticks for the states. And so we see that in a lot of the new programs. On the other side of the aisle, Ranking Member Carper from Delaware, his #1 concern was safety, and he was instrumental in getting new safety money for vulnerable users. Climate change, we see a new title for climate change, and then innovation. So we'll talk through that. And you can see as we go forward some of the balances that the bill makes between those pieces. So in talking about the league priorities going into the bill, one of the first ones was to create changes for transportation alternatives. I'm going to run through this section and then I'll check for questions. So if you have questions on transportation alternatives, go ahead and put them in the question box. So first, just a reminder, transportation alternatives is a set aside from the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. The way it works is the state gets its portion, the Rec Trails program comes off the top, 50% goes to the state to run a competitive process, and then 50% gets broken up by population. So the large metropolitan areas, the large MPOs, metropolitan planning organizations, they get a chunk that then they run a competition through. And then there's other funds that are set aside for those other side populations. So small communities of 5,000 or less, or a population between 200 and 5,000. And that's so communities can compete with like communities. But both of those boxes, both of those are also run by the state. So the first set of changes we wanted were on funding. Again, we had been stuck at $850 million per year. What we wanted to do was change transportation alternatives to a percentage of surface transportation block grant programs. We had asked for 10%. What we got is we are still not a percentage, but we got the equivalent in dollar amount. So in 2021, transportation alternatives would go up to $1.2 billion. That's a 40% increase in the first year. So our funds increased faster than all the other programs, basically to make up for the slow rate of increase under the FAST Act. And then it goes up to that, so it's till it's almost $1.3 billion in 2025. So it keeps pace with inflation, keeps pace with the program. The other thing we wanted to do is once that money gets divided down between the state portion, the state competitive process, and the part broken by population, we had wanted to go 2/3 population, 1/3 state. We didn't get that exactly, but we did see some movement in what we feel like is a positive direction. So 57.5 in population. So that ensures that the money still gets broken up on a geographically equal way, and also that those MPOs, those large MPOs, get a little more funding. And then the state still has 42.5% to do their grant process. So this is the changes in green that we see there. The next set of changes we wanted to do were on state flexibility. One of the things that we heard from state DOTs was that some of the applications they're getting from local governments are not of a quality ready to be funded. And some states, such as Idaho, had taken some of their own money and were offering technical assistance to local governments to write their TA applications, and they were getting a much better quality. So we pushed to allow states to use up to 5% of their transportation alternatives funds on technical assistance to local governments to help with that. We asked for 5%, we got 7%. I would say that is because the chairman is from a rural state, and so a higher percentage helps with that. A couple other things, we wanted to give some flexibility in the match. So for instance, if you are wanting to do a safety project out of transportation alternatives, we want to allow the state to use some of their safety money, their Highway Safety Improvement Program money, as that 20% match to make up for the local match. That's in there. There's also some flexibility at the project level. And what that means is that the overall transportation alternatives program has to stay at 80% federal, 20% local, but a state or an MPO could decide, hey, we've got an underserved community in our area, maybe they don't even have sidewalks around their school, we're going to fund them at 90%. And then we have this other project where the local government is offering a higher than 20% match, because we see most cities actually go up to 75 or 70 or 25 to 30% match. And so we'll do that and use that extra money at the underserved area. So we were happy to see that. And third, we had seen particularly from Western states, instead of breaking things up between the population side and the state competitive process, they just wanted to sub-allocate all of it. And different FHWA state offices were ruling on that differently. This bill has language saying you can do that if FHWA approves, so FHWA will have to have a plan on what that means, and if there's transparency on how the money gets spent. So again, looking at our chart, we've got the 7% for technical assistance. That's up to 7%. A state doesn't have to use that whole portion. There's options in making the local match, and there's also that choice if you want to sub-allocate all of it. The third bucket that we were looking for changes in on transportation alternatives was to increase local control. So a lot of those large MPOs, under the FAST Act, they have the ability to award the program, so to choose who's going to get the money, but they can't obligate the funds, which means they can't sign the contract and implement the project. Under this new bill, ATIA, which I'm sorry is the American Transportation Infrastructure Act, under ATIA, they have that authority to obligate, which we believe will get those MPO projects moving faster and implemented, because right now they have to wait for the state, and most states will do their own priorities first. So we think that this will get some of those urban area projects moving faster. Another piece, this was really a typo back in MAP 21 in 2012, that small MPOs were not listed as eligible to apply to the state competitive process. In this bill, they are. Right, so those are the changes that we made in the Transportation Alternatives Program. So again, if you have any questions, please write them down. Okay. I got a question on what sort of activities are covered under the expanded funding for technical assistance. That is to help with the engineering and design and in the application process. The idea is that some local communities may not have the ability to do that on their own, so that the state will help with that. Thank you. All right. A couple other small changes to the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program are other aspects of it. Sub-allocation remains at 55%. And what that means is, of this larger program, the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, it's one of the more flexible programs. 55% of that money is sub-allocated down to local governments. So large MPOs, again, get their portion and they can obligate funds. And then the smaller communities, there's money set aside for them to be used in their areas, but that's run by the state. There's a couple of new eligibilities: wildlife crossing and waterfront infrastructure. And then we also saw the Safe Routes to School program amended to extend to high schools. So again, under transportation alternatives, Safe Routes is one of the eligible uses, and you can use that to build sidewalks, bikeways, bike parking, etc. around a school. And Safe Routes to School is one of the only areas within transportation alternatives that you can do programming work with. And so that is extended to high schools as well. All right. One more thing that affects the Transportation Alternatives Program is that the bill has requires that USDOT do a study on the use of recreational fuels. So that's things that are going into ATVs, snowmobiles, those sorts of things. There's a gas tax that's paid on that. And originally when the Recreational Trails Program was created, it was that money that paid for it. Now those funds have been delinked, but that is still the argument for having a recreational trails program in the transportation program. The bill now requires USDOT to work with Treasury to assess the amount spent on recreational gas tax and determine whether that gas tax revenue is equivalent to what's being spent on the Rec Trails program funds. It also says that in doing the study, they can consult with Federal Highways, Treasury, the state rec departments, and organizations representing rec trail users. So this is something that Rails to Trails and the Recreational Trails Coalition work to get into the bill. All right. So moving on to safety, this is something that I'm very excited about. And just check to see if there's more questions. Okay. And that is that there's new safety money so this is new money that's put into that Highway Safety Improvement Program funding. So it's an extra $250 million a year. It is sub-allocated, so again, those large MPOs will get their own money, which they can do projects in their area and implement those. There's also money that is set aside for the different communities, of the smaller communities of different sizes. And what the bill says is that, yes, states, you get this new money, MPOs, you get this new money, but you have to spend it on bicycle and pedestrian improvements where you have high rates of vulnerable user fatalities. So states where 15% or more of fatalities are vulnerable users, and then urbanized areas, which is 50,000 or more, that have a vulnerable user fatality rate of 1.5 per 100,000 population or more. So that's not just those large MPOs of 200,000 or more that is affected, but also smaller communities. To give you a sense of who that affects, this is looking at the states where their percentage of highway fatalities that are bicyclists and pedestrians or non-motorized. I think this non-motorized. So all shades of red, including the pink right now, would have to use that money on biking and walking safety. The pink are in there because they're between 15 and 16.5%. So hopefully they'll spend this money on biking and walking safety, and we'll see that rate drop. And then they won't, well, hopefully we'll see the rate drop in all of those red states, but the pink ones are the most likely to drop out. And then the yellows are ones that are just on the edge. So this is looking at data between 2015 and 2017. Okay, and we've started looking at the larger MPOs, and it's a bit tricky, but we really haven't found any large MPOs at this moment that wouldn't qualify. So if you are in a green state, if you're in Alabama and you don't qualify, but Mobile's MPO does, then that MPO has to spend their portion of the money on bike ped safety, even if the rest of the state doesn't have to. There's another $250 million for safety, which again can only be used for highway safety improvement projects, which is a bit restrictive, and it's not always the state DOT's favorite pot of money. So they can either use that money for safety projects, or they can write a vulnerable road user safety assessment. And if they write that assessment with all of these pieces, then they get to use this money on the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program up to 100% federal use. So they get to use it for more flexible things. And one of the things I'm excited about in this assessment is not only do they have to put down the location of where the fatalities are, but also the speed limit at that location, and identify any corridors where they're seeing a string of fatalities or a pattern of fatalities. They also have to report on the amount they've spent on vulnerable user safety over the last 2 years, both as a dollar amount and as a percentage of their overall highway safety money. And they have to show where they plan to spend on vulnerable user safety over the next 2 years, both in a dollar amount and a percentage. And this is in there for 2 reasons. One, of course, we want to get the state DOTs focused on biking and walking safety, but it also gives advocates, you all, state and local groups, an opportunity to get that data and then use that data in your own advocacy. And so we're excited to see that too. There's also, in the bill says that if you are working on some of those dangerous areas, if you are going to try to fix one of those dangerous areas, it actually makes it easier to go through the permitting process for the state. Now, the state has to write the plan, but they also have to consult with their MPOs. And hopefully if their MPOs want to use that money for things other than HSIP uses, they're going to have to work with their state to create that plan. All right. Okay, I have a question of, will the vulnerable road users assessment be required to capture data on victims, the race, gender, and income? It is not in the law as of now, and that's a really good question. That is something, though, if and when this becomes law, we can work with the US DOT or FHWA in the guidance that they put out to the state. Thanks, Michael. That's a really good question. Okay. Oops. Sorry about that. I'm having a little trouble with my mouse. I'm sorry if this is taking a minute. Shoot. All right. So, okay, there we go. Sorry, there's also a program that's called the $100 million for Race to the Top program. For those who were around during the Obama administration, there was a program under education where states that did a good job raising their scores could then get additional, like, prize money to do new things with. And some of the folks writing this bill at the Senate were part of the Obama administration in the Department of Transportation, so they took that idea. So there's an additional $100 million for Race to the Top. States or urbanized areas. Again, urbanized areas are areas with a population of 50,000 or more. And this is not just bike ped safety. This is for states that show an improvement in overall safety. They apply to the US Department of Transportation for prize money. The secretary chooses the winner based on their safety improvements and any innovations that they're doing. And the state can get awards of between 5 and 30 million. So that's the main changes on the bike ped piece to HSIP. There's a couple of other changes that we really wanted to see. One is that leading pedestrian intervals were added as an eligibility. And the box to the right is something that FHWA has said that this is a proven counter safety measure and shows that they've seen a 60% reduction in pedestrian vehicle crashes at intersections when this has been put in. The other thing, which was a big concern, I think, for a lot of the bicycle advocacy groups, is that non-infrastructure is now eligible again under the Highway Safety Improvement Program, which means you can use it for educational campaigns and enforcement activities. Now, I'm a little bit confused on how the language is. I had read it that HSIP money could pay up to 25% of those programs, but then I saw a summary of the bill that said up to 25% of highway safety funding can go to these activities. So I will get back to you on that. But that is a big improvement. That is something we wanted to see. Another safety program where we saw a change in was at rail crossings with railroads, that they really want to put an emphasis on pedestrian safety. And so that is something we're looking forward to working with them on as well. And I've been talking to the committee, to the House side about that as well. So hopefully that's something we can work on. And finally, I just want to mention another very small program that's in there, and this is BOLLARDS to fight terrorism. If you remember, I think it was 2017, there was a terrorist act in New York City where someone drove a U-Haul truck onto a bike trail and killed and injured a number of people. After that, both members of Congress and senators from New York pushed for some transportation money to create bollards or barriers of some sort in areas where it made sense to protect bicycle and pedestrian multi-use path to protect them from this happening again and from terrorism. So that is in there. It calls on the US DOT to create a grant program to do that. So I am going to, I'll check again for questions on safety. So I got a question on when will this funding and application period begin? Remember, this is just this is what the Senate is putting forth as their transportation bill. It has passed the committee, but it hasn't passed the whole Senate yet, and then it has to be combined with the House bill and go past and get signed by the president. So we don't know yet. The language usually says something like within a 1 year upon passage. I can check on that. So I got a question about in the green states, so the areas that don't have to put that new safety money towards bike ped, how do we find out about the metro area fatality rates and who has that data? So there is you have to do a little bit of calculations because there's FHWA has a safety site, and I can send that on, that shows the number of fatalities per metropolitan area, but then you have to go and get the census data from 2010 and do the math. So, and I got a comment from Christopher Dowes from FHWA asking if pedestrian intervals were already eligible, and saying that they were certainly eligible under TA set aside and therefore under the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. I think they just needed to update HSIP. So they were not explicitly listed, but I don't know for sure that you couldn't do it. We got a question about how much funding is available for the bollards. That program doesn't have a dollar amount on it yet. It's up for FHWA to set that, I believe, but I will double check and get back to you on that. All right, thank you. So then moving on to planning. The league, for those of you who are at the National Bike Summit, we asked you to go lobby on the COMMUTE Act. We actually got all 3 of our asks in this bill, so that's really exciting. The COMMUTE Act is a pilot project that would require the US Department of Transportation to supply access data to 5 states, to 5 large MPOs, 5 small MPOs, and 5 regional planning organizations in rural areas. And what access data does is it's basically modeling data. So this is the example I always use in Madison, where they have a low-income community to the north, a job center, town center to the south. There was no way to get across. That yellow line, they modeled what would happen if we built a bike and pedestrian bridge here. And they found that within that, almost 6,000 households would have access to the services and jobs across the way within a 15-minute bike ride. And so that's the kind of thing it does. You can use it with transit when you're picking where's the best place to put transit stops in terms of access to neighborhoods and communities. You can do things like this for biking and walking. You can even do it for driving. If you've got a part of a highway that is always congested and you want to look at where the local traffic is that's going onto the highway and maybe find another way. So that is in the Senate bill. So we were really excited to see that. There's another program which honestly I didn't even know was on the radar, but I'm really excited to see that in. And this is the Connecting Communities program, otherwise known as the Highway Teardown program or the Anti-Robert Moses program. And basically the idea is if you've got a highway that is separating a community and maybe isn't used that much, this is an example in Baltimore that I think the whole road is 2 miles or less, so it's not getting a lot of traffic. But if you can see at the top of the picture, you've got a neighborhood, and it was built in between the neighborhood, also known as the ditch. They don't even clear it in snowstorms because it's just not used that much. This program is about getting rid of this. So a community, both a local government or a community group is eligible for the planning money to go in and see what it could be changed into. And then the local government would be eligible for funding to actually do the work to do it. Now you have to show that there's not a lot of, that the travel demand can be met by your new plan. So if you're just moving the road to grade, so it's at the same level as the other streets, which would work here, then you can do that. And you have to show how the community will be reconnected. Because one of the ways that they're talking about what it means to be disconnected is that there's not adequate bike ped access across. And I think this program, the money in this program goes up and down through the years, but I think it starts out at 40 or 35 million. So again, it will be a grant program to apply for that. And this is, I just want to say, Senators Cardin and Van Hollen from Maryland really pushed because of this roadway, but I think that there'll be a lot of interest in other communities as well. Other changes to the planning program. They're setting aside 2.5% of all the planning money. I believe that's roughly 9 million for basically complete streets, plans, and policies. You can also do bike network planning through that. You can also do connections between active transportation and rail or active transportation and transit. This is, again, looking for ways to connect people who are not in single occupancy vehicles to getting around the community. There's another program for states that's at 10 million a year, and this is all projects, it's not just active transportation, but the idea is to develop a data-driven and transparent system to prioritize the programs in their STIP. And so the public can look at it, know what's coming up, understand why those projects were chosen. This is something that Virginia has done, and the idea of this bill is to give other states some funding to do something similar. All right, so got questions on the planning side. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about some other league priorities for that. The first is federal lands. We were hoping to get a 5% set aside in federal lands. That is not in this bill. It's something that People for Bikes is working on and we're supporting on, and we're working on that on the House side to get it in there. What I will say about federal lands, they got a 10% increase in funding overall, which is definitely needed. There's also a federal lands access program, which is something you should look at if you're looking to get facilities built that access federal lands, like a road into a park, or are adjacent to that park. This is money that can be used as a local match as well. So you could do a combination of transportation alternatives and the FLAP program. They got a smaller increase, but they increased through the piece. There was also some language added about context-sensitive solutions. Now that language was added more thinking about native plants and getting rid of billboards and things like that. But I believe that we can stretch that to include some potential complete streets changes or ideas. The other thing we've been talking a lot about is new technology and automated vehicles. That is not within the jurisdiction of the Environment and Public Works program, but they do touch on it a little bit. So one of the things that they create is a Center of Excellence on New Mobility and Automated Vehicles. And this is something where DOT will work with the university, probably one of the transportation universities, and to gather information and actually conduct research on how scooter share, bike share, the Uber, Lyft, all the TNCs, et cetera, what their effects are on land use, on equity, on urban design, and on municipal budgets. So that is something we look forward to seeing. Representative Blumenauer has a similar bill in the House, which we're supportive of. And we think it's important to look at some of these larger issues that relate to transportation, but are not maybe actually transportation. On the other side, there is language that is part of the bill that requires FHWA to do a study on automated vehicles on roads. What are the effects going to be on roads, on congestion, on things like that? So that was something that was part of the AV START Act that was in Congress last year but didn't pass. It was one of the good pieces, so we're glad to see that added in with the EPW bill. And finally, there's in the bill is a requirement for the US DOT to work with TRB, the Transportation Research Bureau, on a study on vehicle to infrastructure technology. And I just want to give a shout out on that picture. That's my colleague Ken McLeod doing a virtual reality piece. And we're hoping to have something like that at the summit next year. So you could all try it there. All right. So now I'm going to move on to the climate, but I want to see if there's a question. So there is a question about AV testing, automated vehicle testing. I will say that there was a letter that, so when it comes to automated vehicles and whatever's going to replace the AV START Act, that is actually in the Commerce Committee in the Senate and the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House. So both of those committees are hoping to have a draft of that within the next month or so, or 2 months, I should say, with the Commerce Committee hoping to have their bill, their part of the transportation bill out this fall in September or October. So we are talking to both committees on what we feel like we need on that. I will also say that within the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, there's a subcommittee on consumer protection, and the Democrats on that committee wrote a letter to NHTSA asking about how they are testing automatic emergency braking on pedestrians and bicyclists. So it asks, are you testing on, for people of different races and skin tones? Because we saw that that was an issue. It asks if you're testing with people with wheelchairs. We know that they're not testing with bicycles yet, but we asked about that. What is their timeline? What are the obstacles that they're facing? So the committee asked for answers in mid-August. My guess is that we'll get them maybe mid-September or so. We'll see, but I'll keep you updated on that. All right. Let me see. Okay, so now I want to talk about the climate title, and I think this is just really exciting to see this move forward. And as I said, this was really a priority for Senator Carper. And I was talking to some lobbyists who work on the road builders, the materials associations, things like that. And a couple of them were saying that what they took from this EPW bill is that Senator Carper and his staff are master negotiators. It is a huge, huge accomplishment to get a climate change title in a transportation bill through the Republican Senate or through the committee at this point. So kudos for that. They've got 5 programs in here. I'm going to talk about 3 of them, and then I'll just mention the other two. One is the emissions reduction program. This works very much like the safety program. So there's $250 million additional for CMAQ. CMAQ is the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program. And the way that that program works, the way CMAQ works, is that if you have areas within your state that don't meet clean air standards laid out by the Clean Air Act, then you have to spend this money on CMAQ uses, which are a lot of the uses that are listed here, anything that reduces congestion or air quality. But if you don't have those areas, then you can use the money on a broader list of programs. Under this program, it doesn't matter whether you are a non-attainment area for air quality, it doesn't matter if you're a maintenance area, or if you've never had a problem with air quality, you still have to, you can only use this money on things that reduce carbon emissions. Again, 65% of this money is sub-allocated, so those large MPOs will get their own piece, and then there's money that has to be used in smaller communities. The number of the things that I think we care about, bike ped infrastructure, of course, shifting traffic demand to either other modes or to different times, making intersections work better, the replacing existing infrastructure with energy efficient options, that can even be the lights on your streets, things like that, or developing a carbon reduction plan. I think 2% of this is set aside for those, for planning. Again, like the safety program, there's an additional 250 for CMAQ if you have a carbon reduction strategy and you incorporate that into your STIP. And so that has to identify goals and projects that do those things, that reduce congestion, that facilitate options to single occupancy vehicle traffic, whether that be shifting to modes like biking and walking in transit, whether that be electric vehicles. Again, similar things, encouraging electric vehicles and modes that reduce emissions, and also facilitating the reduction of emissions in the construction and maintenance process. And again, if you have that and it's integrated into your plan and you're building those projects, then you get more flexibility with this money. And then finally, there's again a merit-based grant program. It's $100 million that a state or local government is only eligible if they have lowered their emissions or they have lowered the rate of increasing emissions. And again, the Secretary makes those awards. They're between 50 and 30 million. So that's one program, the emissions reduction program. There's also a congestion relief program, and this is for areas with a population of $1 million $1 million population or more. And so that MPOs themselves can apply, the city can apply, or a state can apply for a project that they're doing in an area that has a high population. It's $40 million a year with awards of $10 million or more. And it's, again, for deployment of the same sorts of things that we've been talking about, things to relieve congestion, shifting to other modes, microtransit. Also, congestion pricing is part of this, and parking pricing. So all of those things, again, I think is really exciting. There is also a stipulation that in doing this work, you must have considered the effect on programs of low-income drivers, and you can have options to ameliorate that effect. That's the second. The third is Project for Resiliency. And again, this sort of breaks down in similar ways. There's a little more money for this one. So that there's formula money, that each state gets money that can only be used on these things. And so you can reinforce infrastructure, particularly on evacuation routes. You can use new and better materials. Again, that was something Mr. Carper was looking for. You can tear down or relocate at-risk infrastructure. Evacuation routes, you can also use natural infrastructure. So if you want to, that can be a marsh, that can be sort of a lock and dam system, that can be natural stormwater runoff. There's a number of things like that. And there's, again, in planning incentives, if you incorporate it into your, if you do some planning and incorporate it into your STIP, there's a rural set aside, I think of 25%, and there is a tribal set aside, which I think is 2%. And then there is, again, a competitive grant of $200,000 a year, and that is broken up into 3 areas: resiliency improvements, which is the largest, the most flexible; coastal resiliency; and evacuation routes. And again, it's for states and urbanized areas can apply to do any of these things. There's one more small resiliency program, which was our final ask for this bill, which was that we've got $1 million a year set aside in a pilot program for local communities to use bikes both in the evacuation, in notifying people of evacuation, but also in the immediate emergency response. And the way this works is a community can apply for this. They have to be working with a bike ped advocacy organization. They also need to be working with a local community development organization or a community organization that may help with things like storm notification and emergency response. And the idea is that we have seen a lot of disaster relief trials going on in cities with people using bikes to get supplies in. But the thought on this one was that it's easier to teach bicycling to people who know, live in, and work in that community than it is to teach bicyclists about a community. So this would pay for training of first responders, to pay for those community organizations to, you know, learn some bicycling skills, learn bike maintenance, and learn how to respond in an emergency response, with the idea that they may know where there are shut-ins when there's an evacuation, or afterwards where to look where people might gather. One of the things that bikes can do really easily, other than bringing in some water, food, medical supplies, is they can bring in a power source. So people who've been stuck in that community, they've lost their power, their phone has died, they really need to reach out to say, hey, I need some help, or just to let their family know, I'm okay, I'm here. And that's one of the things we've seen the bikes used for. So we're excited to see this program get up and running. A couple other changes to CMAQ, because we know CMAQ is a really important program for people for bicycling and walking. Couple of changes. States can now use up to 10% on lock and dam and marine highways, so water infrastructure. The other thing it does is it extends the ability to use CMAQ for operating assistance to transit agencies outside of the large metropolitan areas. You can also use some of that operating assistance for state-supported Amtrak. And what I mean by operating assistance is that most federal funds go to capital improvements, which means the actual building, the building of the road, the building of the rail line, the buying of buses. But operating assistance is maybe what pays the bus drivers, and you know, and that kind of thing. If you remember back when in the recession back in 2009, 2010, this was a huge issue because local governments and transit agencies just didn't have the money. This allows them to flex some of their CMAQ money to that. It also said that there's no time limit or phase out requirement. So you can say we're going to spend X percentage of our CMAQ on this kind of thing for the foreseeable future. All right, I'm going to quickly check for questions on the climate and CMAQ. So there's a question about, does the expanded CMAQ potentially support something like the installation of e-bike charging stations? I would say, so that's not in the bill. I would say potentially yes. And again, that's something we can work with on the guidance. So, and then there was another question about, can the the funding for resiliency programs, can that cover rural areas with existing bike ped infrastructure impacted by things like extreme flooding? And yes, yeah, part of what was in our bike resiliency piece at the beginning was that idea of both identifying and fortifying active transportation routes to transit in the case of evacuation. It's still in that program that you have to identify where those routes are for people to come in and out, but in terms of fortifying that and labeling it as evacuation, getting it out, that is now covered in that larger resiliency program. So we didn't have to have a specific one for bike ped. So great questions on that. Okay. Analysis and next steps. So we got 4 of our 5 asks on this, so we were really happy on that. A couple of reasons I want to just talk about why we were successful. First, I think Tim might be on the phone call, but I just want to do a shout out to Tim Young, who is a longtime advocate for biking and walking in Wyoming and has put a significant amount of effort into working and building a relationship with Senator Barrasso, so that Senator Barrasso's office is open to biking and walking. Wyoming DOT is open to transportation alternatives, and that really paved the way for us moving forward. So this is a public shout out to Tim. Thank you for that. And we are definitely going to work on that federal lands to help pay you back for that. And secondly, that just through the time we've developed really strong relationships with Senator Carper, the ranking Democrat, and Senator Cardin, who is the second ranking Democrat, so part of the leadership team. Senator Carper, you know, we didn't do a bill on safety in the Senate because he wanted to lead on that, and he did a great job leading on that. We're very thankful for that. And then Senator Cardin led on our transportation alternatives piece, the bike resiliency piece, and that community connection program. So just a shout out for all the work he did, and the fact that, you know, we have been talking to Senator Carper's staff since last summer, honestly, on the safety piece, and worked very well with Senator Cardin's staff, so we really appreciate the work there. I also just want to put a shout out to the folks who were at the summit. Because of the summit, we had our ask prepared in January. And so all year, you know, we've been hearing from people like, this bill doesn't matter, they're never going to do it, we don't need to be worried about that. A lot of stakeholders didn't have their platform ready early in the year. We did because of the summit. So when I went into offices, when I was working with Safe Routes National Partnership, and we went into offices talking about transportation alternatives, the staffers, they hadn't heard from a lot of people, and they hadn't necessarily thought through all of their priorities. And so we got into a lot of priority memos. We actually had 4 Republican members of EPW, and I think the same number of Democratic members, put in all or some of our transportation alternatives asks. And because of that, we were able to get almost everything we wanted in that program. So just a lesson when people say, oh, the transportation bill isn't coming this year, I don't need to worry about it. It doesn't mean you don't have to worry about it. Every piece helps, because this bill, even if it doesn't pass by next year, it's going to be the starting point for the Senate next time. And hopefully we won't have to go back and fight those battles. Also, as we move forward, when we look at next steps, I'm just going to go to the House of Representatives first. Now we can go to the Democratic House and say, look what we got in the Senate bill. You've got to do better than the Senate. And so we look forward to pushing on all of those things. The next piece in the Senate will be the Commerce Committee. They work on vehicle safety and a lot of the behavioral stuff. So by vehicle safety, I mean actually the regulations around vehicles. So automated vehicles, automatic emergency braking, also connected vehicles are something we want to work with them on. We've also been supportive of a bill that does smart city grants. This is something that the Obama administration, when Fox was over at DOT, used to push. So it's grants for cities to get up to speed on new technology. we were able to get e-bikes included in that. So that's another place, Michael, where you could do e-bike charging stations or scooter charging stations, I assume, if we get that money in there. So we're pushing on that. People for Bikes is also looking at getting better bike ped data collection. We're working with them on that. And then the last thing I'm thinking about, they also do rail and Amtrak, and thinking about how we can work with them on helping with Amtrak with the goal of getting better access for bikes on Amtrak. So those are the things that are coming next for me. Again, the automated vehicles is coming immediately next. So we'll be working on that. All right, I got a couple more minutes if there's any questions, but that's my last slide. So questions. All right. Seeing none, I would say please feel free to email me at caron@bikeleague.org, and I will take these questions, write up answers, and send them out to everyone who's registered for this. And I will, there was a funding question, I'll double check on any questions that I have here that I wasn't able to answer. All right, so thanks everyone. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks to everyone who came to the summit, who lobbied on these, who sent emails. We really appreciate the effort. We couldn't do it without the support at the local level, so thank you. All right.